Barrett thought she could intimidate Crockett with judicial authority. Crockett's comeback about constitutional balance of power left the courtroom stunned. Welcome to Real Life Stories. Before we dive into this constitutional showdown, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what you'll learn tonight reveals the clash between judicial power and democratic accountability. The Hart Senate Office Building's Committee Room 216 was filled with constitutional scholars, legal experts, and media representatives for what was being called the most important judiciary hearing of the year. The Senate Judiciary Committee had convened a special session on constitutional balance and democratic accountability, a direct response to growing concerns about judicial overreach and the Supreme Court's expanding interpretation of its own authority. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 52, sat at the witness table with the composed confidence that came from holding one of the most powerful positions in American government. As an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, she was accustomed to deference from senators and representatives who recognized the court's constitutional authority. Representative Jasmine Crockett, 35, occupied her position on the committee panel with her characteristic preparation and focus. Her background in constitutional law and criminal defense had made her one of the most effective questioners on judiciary matters, but few expected the confrontation that was about to unfold. The hearing had been proceeding for over an hour, covering topics like judicial ethics, constitutional interpretation, and the scope of Supreme Court authority. Justice Barrett had answered questions with the careful precision expected from someone whose words could influence constitutional law for decades. But tensions began to emerge when the questioning turned to congressional oversight of the judicial branch. Several committee members had raised concerns about the court's recent decisions that seemed to expand judicial power while limiting congressional authority. Representative Crockett had been asking pointed but respectful questions about constitutional balance and the founders' intention for checks and balances between branches of government. Her inquiries were informed by her legal background and her study of constitutional history. Justice Barrett had been responding with increasing formality, clearly uncomfortable with questions that challenged the court's authority or suggested the need for congressional oversight of judicial decisions. The moment that would define the hearing came when Crockett asked about the constitutional basis for judicial review and whether the Supreme Court's interpretation of its own power had exceeded the founders' intentions. Justice Barrett, Crockett said, consulting her notes, Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 78 that the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch because it has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. How do you reconcile that vision with recent court decisions that effectively nullify congressional legislation? Justice Barrett's response was measured but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. Congresswoman Crockett, I think there may be some confusion about the constitutional framework here. The Supreme Court's role in interpreting the Constitution is well established. Marbury versus Madison settled the question of judicial review over 2 centuries ago. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. I'm familiar with Marbury, Justice Barrett, but Chief Justice Marshall was quite careful to limit the scope of that decision. He specifically stated that the court's power extended only to cases where Congress acted beyond its constitutional authority, not to policy disagreements. Barrett's expression showed the first signs of irritation. Congresswoman, with respect, constitutional interpretation requires extensive legal training and judicial experience. The court's decisions are based on careful analysis of constitutional text, historical understanding, and legal precedent. The implication was clear. Barrett was suggesting that Crockett lacked the qualifications to question Supreme Court authority. The room went quiet as everyone recognized the condescending nature of the response. Crockett's reaction was immediate but controlled. She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm but gaining an edge that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. Justice Barrett, are you suggesting that members of Congress lack the constitutional authority or intellectual capacity to provide oversight of the judicial branch? Barrett tried to backtrack. Of course not, Congresswoman. I'm simply noting that constitutional interpretation is a specialized field. Quote, a specialized field, Crockett interrupted, that I happen to have studied extensively. I have a law degree, Justice Barrett. I've argued constitutional cases in federal court. I've studied the same cases, the same precedents, and the same constitutional text that you have. The room was now completely focused on the exchange, recognizing that something significant was happening. Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. But more importantly, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That oath includes the responsibility to ensure that no branch of government exceeds its constitutional authority, including the judicial branch. Barrett's composure began to show cracks. Congresswoman, the separation of powers doctrine clearly establishes the independence of the judiciary. Independence, yes, Crockett said firmly. Supremacy, no. The Constitution establishes 3 co-equal branches of government, Justice Barrett, co-equal, not a judicial monarchy. The legal experts in the gallery began taking extensive notes, recognizing they were witnessing a fundamental challenge to judicial authority. Crockett pulled out a copy of the Constitution from her materials. Justice Barrett, Article 3 establishes the judicial power, but it also clearly states that Congress has the authority to regulate the court's jurisdiction. Article 1 gives Congress the power to impeach federal judges. The founders included these provisions specifically to prevent judicial overreach. Barrett attempted to regain control of the exchange. Congresswoman, these are complex constitutional questions that require what? Crockett interrupted. That require unelected judges to make decisions without any democratic input or accountability? Justice Barrett, with all due respect, you serve for life. You're not accountable to voters. You don't face re-election. The only check on your power is the constitutional authority of Congress to provide oversight. Barrett's voice took on a sharper edge. The court's independence is essential to constitutional governance. Congressional interference with judicial decisions undermines the rule of law. Crockett's response was swift and devastating. Interference, Justice Barrett, or accountability? When the court strikes down laws passed by democratically elected representatives, when it overturns decades of precedent, when it expands its own authority beyond what the Constitution provides, that's not independence, that's judicial supremacy. She stood up, using her full presence to command the room. Justice Barrett, you've suggested that constitutional interpretation requires specialized training that members of Congress somehow lack. But let me remind you of something. Every law we pass, every policy we debate, every decision we make requires constitutional analysis. We don't have the luxury of lifetime tenure and unlimited time for deliberation. We have to understand and apply constitutional principles in real time under political pressure with the knowledge that our decisions affect millions of people immediately. Barrett tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued with controlled intensity. You've served on the court for 4 years, Justice Barrett. I've been in Congress for 6 years. In that time, I've participated in constitutional debates about voting rights, healthcare, immigration, criminal justice, and federal spending. I've had to understand how constitutional principles apply to real-world governance, not just theoretical legal questions. Barrett's attempt to respond was weak. Congresswoman, the court's role is different. Yes, it is different, Crockett agreed. Your role is to interpret the Constitution when cases come before you. Our role is to exercise the constitutional powers granted to Congress by the people. And one of those powers, clearly stated in the Constitution, is oversight of the other branches of government. Crockett sat back down, but maintained her commanding presence. Justice Barrett, when you suggest that Congress lacks the authority or competence to question judicial decisions, you're not defending judicial independence. You're asserting judicial supremacy. And judicial supremacy is not what the founders established in the Constitution. She pulled out another document. James Madison wrote that the legislative branch would be supreme in a Republican government because it's closest to the people. Thomas Jefferson warned about the danger of judicial despotism. Even Alexander Hamilton, who defended judicial review, never suggested that judges should be beyond democratic accountability. Barrett sat silent, clearly unprepared for such a systematic constitutional challenge from a member of Congress. Crockett delivered her conclusion. Justice Barrett, I respect the court's constitutional role. But respect is not the same as deference, and independence is not the same as supremacy. When the court exceeds its constitutional authority, when it substitutes its policy preferences for democratic governance, when it claims immunity from accountability, that's when Congress has not just the right, but the obligation to exercise its constitutional oversight powers. The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Constitutional scholars were already analyzing what they had just witnessed. a member of Congress systematically challenging Supreme Court authority using constitutional text and founding principles. Barrett's final response was notably subdued. "Congresswoman, the court always strives to stay within constitutional bounds." Crockett's reply was gentle but firm. "Justice Barrett, that's exactly why congressional oversight exists. Not to attack the court, but to ensure that all branches of government, including the judicial branch, remain within the constitutional framework the founders established." Within hours, legal experts were calling Crockett's response a masterclass in constitutional law and democratic accountability. Law schools began incorporating the exchange into curricula on separation of powers and constitutional governance. The hearing marked a turning point in the relationship between Congress and the Supreme Court, demonstrating that judicial authority, like all governmental power, must ultimately answer to constitutional principles and democratic accountability.